Welcome everyone. I'm very happy to introduce today's literary rendezvous at Rue Cambon and my fellow guests, author Katie Kitamura.
Hello. Hi.
And our moderator and journalist, Caroline Issa.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
When I first encountered Katie Kitamura's writing, I was struck by the way she holds silence within her sentences. Her prose is clean, almost spare, yet it reveals the fracture lines beneath ordinary moments. A conversation that trails off, a gesture that means more than it shows, a closeness that is in fact a distance. She does not fill in every gap. Instead, she lets the crack remain visible, and it's in that space that the reader feels the tension and the quiet violence of what is not said. Katie Kitamura questions our difficulty in being sincere and in seeing the truth about ourselves. Her characters often perform roles, adopting masks and scripts, as a way to avoid facing the emptiness beneath the surface of their lives. Her work exposes the vanity that underlines these performances, the desire to be seen in a certain light, to control the narrative of who we are, even at the cost sometimes of honesty and real connection. She questions also the cost of maintaining the illusions we hold about ourselves and others. Katie, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you today, and thank you for accepting my invitation and to be with us here in Paris in the beautiful Setel Library. Caroline, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. So at the end of this discussion, we'll open up to the audience for questions, but you'll have to wait until then because we're going to start first here. And to give some background, Katie teaches a creative writing program at New York University, and she's actually in Paris for a summer term right now. And she's established herself as both a literary artist and cultural critic, writing for the New York Times Review of Books, The Guardian, and Granta, amongst others. Her books include Gone to the Forest, The Long Shot, A Separation, Intimacies, and very most recently, Audition, which we're going to be talking about. So, Katie, let's start with what I think is a brilliant strategic choice. You don't give your protagonists names. Now, your protagonists, their backgrounds remain quite elusive, and we sort of hungrily grab and to snap up any details that we can get to contextualize them. And I'm curious, why don't you name them, first of all? And also, what happens in this space of vagueness and obscurity? Are you creating space for readers to project themselves into these women's experiences, or is there some other empowering mechanism at work here?
I mean, I think names are remarkably powerful in life and in fiction, and they contain a great deal of information. From a name, you can sometimes gather knowledge about somebody's gender, their class, their race. And it's also one of the mechanisms, I think, whereby we situate people within a certain social structure. And in particular, I would say in relationship to marriage and to family. My characters are very much women who have perhaps only temporarily, but in some ways quite decisively slipped out of a social structure. They're people who are living in a much more contingent and uncertain way. They don't have the security of a name. They don't have the security of a social position. And that leaves them quite porous to the world. I think they're very vulnerable characters in a lot of ways. They're quite lonely characters. But I think the flip side to that is that they have a certain amount of freedom. And I think I don't give them names so that they can keep that little bit of freedom for themselves.
Talking about that freedom, your latest book, Audition, is deeply invested in the ways that our sense of self is shaped and sometimes destabilized, right, by the people who are closest to us. And the novel suggests that identity is not fixed, but constructed through the roles that we perform, perhaps for lovers, for family, for friends, and that these performances can really shift dramatically depending on who is in the room. Your main character is a middle-aged actress, and with her, you explore the idea that our identities are shaped by the roles that we perform, both on stage and in life. And so we're actually going to start with the first reading from Audition. And here we see our protagonist taking a walk with a young man. Their relationship is not fully defined to the reader yet, or even to those who surround them. He could be her younger lover, he could be her son, but he's adamant that their relationship is of a nature that the narrator just says cannot be true. And it's here where we're going to pick up. And I'm really happy to welcome our reader, who is one of actually Katie's students, India Ennenga.
You can be entranced by an idea, I said, and at a certain point you can no longer see the edges of it. Xavier watched me attentively, as if the words in some way followed what had just been said. But of course they did. They were a kind of peace offering or confession. I've experienced it myself, I continued. It's something that happens every time I prepare for a role. In some ways, the part is only working if I lose sight of the shore. But at the same time, it's important to be able to come out the other side. You have to be able to come up from air. Otherwise, you won't survive. He nodded, and I fell silent. This had not always been an issue. For a long time, there had been a gap between the fullness of the life I felt inside me, which, like all lives, was complex and contradictory, experience stratifying into the matter that makes up a person. There had been a gap between this internal landscape and the near comical flatness of the parts I was given to play, made up as they were of cliches and stereotypes, empty of imagination. For people like me, who looked like me, there were no parts. Or rather, there were only parts that were commensurate with erasure, whether through the thinness of stereotype or through simple marginalization. Often these characters were quite literally silent, a moving image, and nothing else. I suppose it was even worse because I was a woman. At one point, my agent had suggested that I might change my name. He said that there was something racially indeterminate about my appearance. With a different name, there would be better parts. Parts. A word that implied that there were parts, and then there was a whole into which those parts might cohere. A whole that might be a play, or a film or a series, a whole that might even be a career, a body of work that could exist in the public imagination. Of course, I was not indeterminate to myself, and I did not change my name, and for a long time it did not seem likely that my work would achieve that totality, whether I changed my name or not. I had time to wonder what it meant, who the work was made and performed for, whose imagination I was being subjugated to because I knew it was not my own. As a consequence, for many years I did my work without fully committing myself to it. Even as the parts improved, I never confused the experience depicted on stage or on screen with the experience of my actual life. The material simply did not have the requisite dimensionality. There was nothing in these parts that had the stab, the throb, the unruliness of the real. But things changed. The film with Murata was important. Even in a language I was speaking more or less phonetically, I was more a person in that role than I had ever been before. People saw me differently after that, and the success of the film happened to coincide with a change in the culture, in the writing, a change in the way of seeing. For the first time, I was allowed to be human. I could even be at the center of a story. And later still, there were parts that consumed me, so that I could say the life that was performed on a set or in the theater could at times feel more real to me than my actual life. This change in the culture represented a tremendous gift. Without it, all the parts that followed, including this one with Anne, they would not have been possible. But it was also a danger for a person of my disposition, for whom the managing of these borders was not always easy.
Thank you, India. So I'm going to ask you a question now, given I understand that you studied acting and now you're at NYU doing creative writing and under the tutelage of Katie and also Hari, I understand you took a class from. I'm curious, what are your thoughts having read this passage?
I mean, it's such a beautiful passage and it's so subtle. I think as an actor especially, you're always sort of reckoning with the difference between the interior self and the performed self. But I also think it really encapsulates so much of what the book is getting at and very subtly foreshadows this idea that when those boundaries become blurred, it's dangerous, but also something incredible is possible in those moments.
So, Katie, having read that passage and more, I'm curious how you distinguish between the authentic self and the performed self, and what insights do you gain from exploring this distinction through prose?
It's really interesting. I have young children, and when they were about 3 or 4 or 5, they entered through an extended period of constant role play. They were always playing a part of some kind. They would be playing a mother or a daddy or a teacher or a truck driver or whatever it might be. And it was in that process of playing these different parts that they were learning what it meant to be in the world. And something that really struck me was that when you look at children playing, that seems entirely natural. That seems to be healthy. Even I think, you know, if you have a child who isn't doing any role play, then you're told as a parent that you need to worry a little bit. But once we become older, that sense goes away. And then suddenly, if performance is at all part of how you constitute your identity or your way of being or your way of relating to other people, that is seen as actually perhaps unnatural, as artificial in some way. And I'm very, very fascinated by the idea that mutability and growth and change is something that happens only in childhood or only to the young, and that it's something that falls away as you become older. And I had a very interesting experience with my last novel, which is called Intimacies, which is about a woman who is not especially young, who moves to The Hague, and she takes a job working as a simultaneous interpreter at a war crimes tribunal. And often when the book was being summarized, it would be described as a young woman moves to The Hague to start a new life. And I was very struck by this idea that change is something that happens to the young and not something that happens to people throughout their lives and in the middle of their lives. My sense is, as a person in the middle of my life, that things remain extraordinarily mutable and subject to change. And so that's part of what I'm interested in. And I'm very much interested in the tools that we use to construct our identity. I mean, I am a mother and a teacher and a wife and a friend, and sometimes I'm a writer. Yeah. And it really strikes me that each of those parts, they come with these scripts, you know, whether or not you're aware of using them, you rely on them a little bit. There's an aspect of performance that permeates all of our lives, but it's very bracing when you consider some of the most intimate relationships, for example, your relationship with your child, and you see an element of something artificial or something performative. That's quite frightening. And I think as a novelist, that becomes incredibly exciting to think about.
You've said in another interview, I think, that a friend of yours told you that every time her son comes home from college, there is that idea of sort of the performance of, you know, who they are and what you think they are. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking of that dynamism. Yeah,
I mean, the origins of my most recent book, Audition, which is about a character who may or may not be the central character's son, really stemmed from a headline I read that said, "A stranger told me he was my son," and I was obsessed with the sentence, and I was very preoccupied with the opposition between stranger and son, these two seemingly irreconcilable words. And I said to my friend who has a son in his 20s, I said, this sentence is so incredible and I feel like there's a novel there, but I can't quite parse it. And I said the sentence to her and she just looked at me and said, that's describing parenthood. That is what it is like every time my son comes home from college. And I think that is in so many ways what the book is about for me, is the sense that at the heart of these very, very universal experiences of love and parenthood and making art or being a partner to somebody, there are these things that are incommensurate, that cannot be reconciled.
Charlotte, I feel that the characters in Katie's books resist easy definition, exactly what Katie was just saying. They're neither just wives or romanticists or professionals, careerists, mothers, but something that's always a much more ambiguous. And Katie's books also feel like they're essential documentation of contemporary women's experiences, where characters embody this particular moment where traditional structures are shifting. And I'm curious whether you see this as a newer direction for female protagonists in contemporary fiction in a broader sense.
Yes, I think that Katie's characters that resist easy categorization is something we can see in a lot of contemporary fiction. You can think of Rachel Cusk, for example, in some of her novels, and many other writers. But yeah, I would say maybe the idea that the exploration of ambivalence is not seen as a flaw anymore, but as a structure. So this is something that has probably changed in contemporary fiction. Because if you think about it, that exploration is not completely new, because, for example, Mrs. Dalloway of Virginia Woolf is an example of a woman assigned to a role in society, and throughout the day she experiences all those shifting states and re-questions her own script. So it's something that has already existed before, but now it's a bit different because it's really a structure of the contemporary novel. But what is new, I would say, is that somehow these scripted roles or those traditional structures still remain. But women specifically, we believe that we're free to define ourselves the way we want, that you can be a wife, a writer, a teacher, all these roles. And we have the illusion that these traditional structures are not at work within us, but they are still inscribed in our ways of reacting in a much more subconscious way. So to have that clarity is harder because we have that feeling of guilt, of unease, but we can identify sometimes that these structures are still there. So that's why somehow we have more freedom, but we have more guilt and a bigger difficulty to identify this. And somehow also the fact that when you have a script and a role is something very reassuring. And today, the fact that we can play different roles, it's more accepted socially, doesn't mean that it's easier, because it's a new kind of freedom that comes with a feeling of being disoriented and not having that script you can, hang on to.
I think that word disorientation is really interesting because, Katie, your books seem to have a theory about relationship, which is that they're essentially elaborate performances where nobody's quite sure the role they're playing. So in Audition, you've got this young man who claims to be the narrator's son, but maybe he's not. In A Separation, the narrator lies to her mother-in-law about the state of her marriage, yet she still obeys her very commanding directives. And then in Intimacies, the narrator is living in her new boyfriend's house, among the detritus of his supposedly failed marriage, not quite sure of their status. The relationships all seem to be on such shaky basis of reality. How have you honed this theory of relationships, and what made you want to examine family and personal dynamics with such focus?
I mean, I think always when you're writing, you're very conscious of the tradition you're writing in, and of both the kind of wonderful gift of that tradition and also of the kind of things that you take for granted slightly, that you replicate without really being aware of it in some ways. You know, I guess you could say the conventions of your form. You become very acquainted with them as a reader and then as a writer. And I think one of the conventions of fiction in both stories and novels is that you start with a character, and over the course of the story, through the events of whatever, that character is changed. And there's a very, very unified arc that you follow as a reader, and you say, I can see this event impacted this character in this way, and that is why they have been transformed. I think I'm less interested in this kind of theory of unity in some way in character, in part because I look at my own life and I find that it's impossible to kind of create a unified sense of when I look at myself when I was 16, I never think, that's why I am the way I am now. I think, my God, what was going on back then. And so I'm much more interested in figuring out if there's a way to create that same sense of momentum and that same dynamism, but through looking at relationships instead, and at looking at the way people are different depending on who they are with. And it's quite extreme in my fiction, I admit, but I think it's probably true for all of us. You know, the way you behave if you are talking to a police officer is different to the way you might speak when you're talking to your best friend. And these are just they're different identities that you slip into. And one of the things that was especially fun, I would say, with Audition is that it's a novel in which almost nothing takes place. But what happens instead is that the nature of the relationships she's having with these different people changes very radically. So in one part of the book, this character is not her son. In another part, he is her son. And in those shifts alone, I hope that there's enough change in the character that you come to know her.
Yeah. And we're going to come to that very soon. But before we do, you've worked as a translator, and themes of translation are all over your novels. Across many of them, your narrators are often women whose professions require them to channel the words and emotions of others, in fact, whether they're interpreters or actors. What fascinates you about characters who act as vessels for other people's language and stories?
It's something that I've been thinking about over the last 3 books in particular, I think. And all of these women are characters who are unnamed, and they speak the words of other people. In a lot of ways, they're mouthpieces that are being controlled by other figures. And I think this goes back, Charlotte, to what you were speaking about. I think we operate with the sense that we have a great deal of agency. We feel as if we have the capacity to make powerful choices about our lives and our place in the world. I'm not sure that's true. I think we have the illusion of tremendous agency, but I think often in reality, we have very little control over our lives. And so I'm very interested in the idea of passivity. And I think I explore passivity in part through this structure of having characters who have language, you know, that they're the mouthpieces for the words written by other people. It's not a coincidence that I think in both The Separation and in Audition, the central characters are married to writers, but they themselves are not writers. And I'm very interested in what happens to the body when it contains the language of somebody else. And I'm very interested in what happens to language when it is spoken by somebody new. And that's something that I think was a very big theme in my book Intimacies, which is about a simultaneous interpreter. In the process of researching that book, I spoke to quite a few interpreters. And one of the things they talked about a lot was both the sense of a kind of trauma of speaking testimony, and also the strangeness of speaking about experience that was not, in fact, actually their own.
Interesting. Well, talking about vessels for stories, we have a little surprise for Katie. Because I'm delighted to say that we have a previous guest from the Rendezvous littéraires with a message, the author Siri Hustvedt. And she's got something to contribute to this conversation, so we'll take a little listen now.
Hello, Katie. Siri here. I have started many novels and don't finish them. Or if I persevere to the last page, they vanish into the cultural ether without leaving a single mark on me. Your books haunt me. The last 3 novels, especially, written in the first person, have left me with restless, peripatetic ghosts made from your stories. Thank you, Katie, for those phantoms that traveled from you to the page and then into me, for the enchantment of reading that lasts. Thanks again, Katie.
I mean, she's so spot on with that word haunting. What do you think when you hear that message?
I adore Siri. As you might guess, I feel very emotional. I mean, she's a mind I've lived with for a long time. I've been conscious and aware of her work from even before I started writing fiction. She's really one of the most brilliant people I know. But on a more personal level, I think she's one of the first people who took my work seriously. You know, she was talking to me about what it meant to be a writer and to be a female writer in particular, really long before I felt that anybody else was. And there was something about somebody like Siri taking my work seriously that gave me permission to take my own work seriously. So yeah, it's very emotional for me to hear her.
Well, it's I think she nails it with how we all feel about reading one of your books. We now have a second reading moment, and Charlotte, you've chosen a short extract from A Separations.
In childhood, words are weightless. I shout, I hate you, and it means nothing. The same can be said for I love you. But as an adult, those very words are used with greater care. They no longer slip out of the mouth with the same ease. I do is another example, a phrase that in childhood is only the stuff of play acting, a game between children, but then grows freighted with meaning. How many times had I myself spoken these words? Only once since becoming an adult. Christopher and I were married in a courtroom and arrived only minutes before the brief ceremony. There was no rehearsal. The judge assured us that we need only repeat after him. Even an idiot couldn't get it wrong. And so when I said, I do, before the assembled group of our family and friends, it was for the first time, or at least the first time since childhood. I remembered being surprised by the power of the ritual, the ceremonial act of speaking these words, which took on a deep and almost maniac significance. It suddenly made sense that these words, I do, would be paired with the archaic and unreasonable phrase, until death do us apart, which was morbid and apparently out of place in what was meant to be a joyful occasion, but which nonetheless served a clear purpose: to remind the participants of the crazed wagger they were making in this act being marriage. I tried to remember what else I had felt during the ceremony, not so many years ago, but long enough for my memory to be uncertain. I thought there had been a brief moment of terror, but mostly I had been happy. I had been very happy for a long time. It was a good and optimistic marriage. For all these reasons, it was difficult to contemplate the pronouncement of the word that would destroy all that optimism, however outdated. And so, although I remained at the hotel in order to ask Christopher for a divorce, I found that I was in no hurry to confront him. I had made a decision that I believed to be absolute, and yet I could have sat in the sun for days, for weeks, without moving, without doing anything, without speaking a word.
Thank you, Charlotte. Katie, your prose is so precise and so controlled. Every detail is considered. Your novels often avoid backstory, focusing instead in the present moment. And the inner monologue of the narrators reveal nuggets of details and emotion. How do you decide what to reveal and what to leave unsaid? And what effect do you hope this has on your readers in terms of how do you want them to participate in filling in what isn't there?
Such a lovely question. A lot of it is quite intuitive, I think. It's not that I have a kind of murder board for my characters. I don't know what their favorite color is. I mean, I don't know their names. I don't have names for them inside my head at all. But I think one of the gambles I suppose gambles is the right word, that my books take is the idea that even if you withhold this information, even if you withhold information as basic as somebody's name, if you immerse the reader very, very deeply inside the point of view and the perspective of a character, they can nonetheless feel close enough that they can traverse the world with the character, which is kind of all you need from your reader to open up a book. I mean, I'm allergic to backstory. I don't like it very much. The one time I tried to write backstory, in fact, I wrote very, very extended backstory for a minor character in my last novel, Intimacies. And then when I gave the book to my husband to read, he was like, you have let this strange secondary character hijack your novel and you've absolutely got to cut all of that.
And you listened.
And I absolutely listened. My one experiment in kind of like childhood to adulthood was an absolute failure. But I think one of the reasons is because there's a kind of sense with backstory that, the convention of a novel is you open it up and here's a predicament, and then you reverse and you go into the backstory. And this idea that this little capsule summary of the past in some way will provide a key to who you are in the present feels to me a narrative contrivance and also fundamentally untrue, because I would like to believe that who I am is not merely a factor of a handful of isolated incidents in my childhood, but in fact that there are many, many other things going on into the making of how a character exists on the page. And then I would say I don't use a great deal of detail. I'm always very interested in what happens when you remove an element of a novel and what that makes space for. And I think ultimately what I'm hoping for is that I create a structure for a book that is capacious enough for the reader to step inside and to make it alongside me. I really think truly of my books as collaborations with the reader. I think they are made in the space between the reader and me. And I feel that's the case for every book. The most intimate and optimistic thing I do every single day is to read, because when I read, I open myself up to the mind of another person. I encounter another person in a book, and I hope to write the kind of fiction that allows the reader to do the same thing.
I love that idea of gambling. I definitely think you've made the right gamble, absolutely. And I love the idea of that co-creation with your reader. It's a really beautiful idea.
I was very lucky this past weekend, and I met Jane Campion, who is one of my heroes, and I'm always scared to meet my heroes, but she absolutely surpassed every dream of what I thought she might be. And we spoke a little bit about what it meant to take risk in making a work of art. She was very interesting, and obviously this is somebody who's taken tremendous risks in her work, and it's an extraordinary body of work. And she said, the thing is, you have to always ask, what is the risk for? It can't just be solely for the sake of fascination. And I think that's really, really true. When you take a risk, when you do something that is maybe unconventional in some way, I think you always have to think beyond the effect, because there's a kind of tendency, if you're only trying to create effect, that the novel remains a question of surface. And so I think if instead the risk you're taking reflects something fundamental about what you feel about character or experience, then it's a risk worth taking.
Well, let's talk about risk, because we want to talk about the remarkable structural innovation in Audition. So the novelist's split in two distinct halves, with the second part upending much of what we thought we understood about the characters and their relationships. It felt really quite revolutionary to me, and I had to sort of scramble back and reread pages thinking that, maybe I'd gone mad and I'd kind of completely misunderstood. How did you come up with this very destabilizing structure, and what effect did you hope it would have on a reader's sense of narrative reality and the boundaries between what we've been talking about, performance and truth?
Thank you so much for saying that, Karen.
Incredible.
As I said, the starting point of the novel was this sense that there are aspects of our lives that cannot be reconciled into a single narrative, whether it's the kind of parts that we play as women, or whether it's something much more fundamental to the experience of a relationship. And I think I'd explored or tried to explore that in my fiction previously, primarily through narrative and psychology. But always as a writer, you're thinking, what are all the tools that are available to me? And I knew that structure and form was something that I had not really utilized to the full extent. And so I found myself thinking, is there a way of writing about this sense of incommensurability, but not writing about it, but directly writing it? And it seemed to me that if I could write a novel that had a big rupture in it, two halves that are mutually exclusive, that cannot sit alongside each other, then I would make some way towards exploring that in another form. I have to give absolutely credit to my French editor who is here. She was the first person I spoke to about this novel. And it's always very interesting who you choose to talk to about a book in its very early stages, because it's quite fragile. I don't want to go so far as to say you can ruin a book by talking about it too early, but I tend to be quite careful. But I think I had this intuition that Raphael would be able to help me. And I spoke to her about it, and she was very like, of course. And I was like, oh. and then she said, and maybe it can go back and forth the other way. And so then this idea of writing a book that had the structure of a Mobius strip, that was circular, that could keep folding in on itself, really unfolded. There were aspects of it that were for sure technically challenging. I developed this style over these 3 books that's quite, as you said, stripped back and does not have a great deal of detail. And I think at a certain point with this book, I thought, okay, I've developed this style, but what is it for and what can it do? And it struck me that the lack of detail actually meant that in the second half of the book, I could write sentences that could be read in 2 different ways. And so that was how it came about.
Charlotte, how did you feel having read the book? What was your sort of sense of reality having encountered this incredible structure?
Well, as you were saying, it's very rare when you read a novel to reread while you're reading it,
Yeah.
And this is something that happened to me while I was reading Audition, where when the rupture happens, I reread the first part and then reread again, and that feeling of disorientation and madness, was kind of the first thing I felt. It made me reflect on trust as well, on how I started doubting about my own way of perceiving the structure, or what I had imagined, what my expectations were as a reader. Could I trust the narrator, the writer? I guess that developing a capacity to approach the truth is our capacity to support contradiction and ambivalence without having to choose one or the other. And I think that today a lot of issues are to do with that desire to find a fixed perspective, a fixed kind of point that will create a beautiful resolution of all the contradictions. But that narrows considerably our relationship to truth and to reality. Literature, in that sense, is very important because it's a way where we can somehow train our capacity to accept and support ambivalence and contradiction and that rupture that is in every single one of us.
Yeah, that's so true. Katie, for our audience, who obviously appreciates both style and substance, what do you hope lingers with readers as they close one of your books? Is it a mood? Is it a question? Is it a sense of possibility?
It's a beautiful question. We were speaking earlier about our favorite parts of the writing process, and I said that my favorite part is the beginning, when I start and it really feels like the expanse is limitless and the book could be anything. And then, you write and you write, and then the book is finite and it is merely what it is. I think what I hope to do and what I try to do is create an ending that feels like an opening, if there's any way of doing that. I often think about the beautiful short story, the Chekhov short story, Lady with a Lapdog, which is very, very simple story. But in the last 2 pages, it's like you're in a room, you think you know the room or the house very well, and then suddenly all the doors open and the possibilities seem limitless. There are so many questions that are asked in the final pages of that short story. And so I think if I could have a feeling, I would like the book to feel like the door opening.
Charlotte, how would you describe the feeling once you've finished a Katie Kitamura book?
Destabilizing, but no, I would say a feeling of stillness somehow and of a quiet violence, I would say. You kind of grasp the undercurrents within you and within conversations and within a lot of things that we have difficulty accessing. As you were saying, you wish to create an opening. Well, I think that when you close a book and you're constantly reflecting about the undercurrents in your own life and it's what's happening around you, I think that means the book has opened a door and something that continues to be within us. And it's the same way as you think about the sea, and underneath the sea there is a whole landscape that is hidden and that is mysterious and that can be difficult to access. And I think that it has that effect of wanting to explore that underneath that's hidden. So that's how I would describe it.
My last question before I open it up to you, the audience, is I'd love to know if you're reading any young female authors, 1, and 2, what advice you would give to any young writers.
I primarily read female writers not by intention, but by taste, I think. And I read a great many young female writers. And I'm very lucky because I teach with some of my absolute favorites.
That is lucky.
Including Raven Leilani and Tess Gundy, who are both on the faculty with me at New York University. And I would never dare give any of these women any advice at all because they don't need it at all. They know exactly what they're doing with their work. I think the advice I would give to myself maybe when I was younger, which is something that I feel that all 3 of those writers who I've named understand and have always understood, but which it took me a little bit of time to understand, which is that writing fiction is an act of exposure. You are revealing yourself in so many ways. And I think it's easy to think that if you're writing about somebody whose experience is different from yours, or you are not yourself present in as an avatar, as a character of some kind, that maybe you're not in the book. But in fact, every single sentence, you reveal yourself. I have so many friends who are writers, and when I read their work, I see them on every single page. And so I think to become comfortable with that idea of exposing yourself in your fiction and being willing to be vulnerable with the reader and with yourself, that's something I wish I'd known earlier, but I feel like I'm starting to understand now.
I'd like to open it up to the audience now. I think we have time for a few questions.
When you look back when you were very young, would you go again and start writing?
It's a really interesting question. I came to writing relatively late. I started writing in my late 20s. In fact, I started writing fiction in my late 20s. And up until that point, I was really a reader, and I was shaped through reading. And I still think of myself as more of a reader than a writer. I spend many more hours of the day reading, sadly, than I do writing. It's been a really delightful surprise to find that I was able to write. I think I'm still in that process of discovery. But in terms of would I do it again, I actually think there's so many different paths my life could have taken. But I'm very happy in the one that I've ended up in.
Hi. This is a technical question. Okay, because you mentioned you have young children, or you had while you were writing at some point. Literally, how do you create a room of one's own in which to write? Layla Samani talks about locking the door of her office with her kids, like banging down the door. I sound like I'm joking, but I'm really serious. What do you do?
For a long time, my writing desk was wedged between the foot of my bed and my daughter's crib. Literally, it was like this. And it bothered me for a long time. I felt that I didn't have space to think. It's thinking more than writing. I think dreaming, like the space to dream, I felt I didn't have it. And then at some point, I realized that I was literally writing from the middle of my life, and I had to write that way, and that was the only way I could do it. And so that's how I do it now. I'm really writing from the middle of my life. I don't have a locked door, either literally or in my mind either. It's very, very porous. It moves in and out all the time. And I think I've had to accept that that is how it is for a period. And it has affected my work quite directly. Audition is not a book I could have written if I didn't have children and if I didn't live inside the experience of having children as I am writing. But having said that, I'm a huge advocate for going away for short periods of time and being able to immerse yourself fully into your work, because I think when you can stay in the kind of dream state of writing for more than 3-4 hours, but for days, something does unlock, a different kind of logic emerges. And I think it's very hard to be kind of starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And in fact, the break in Audition in the middle of the book, I had that idea while I was at a residency in Switzerland, and I was maybe 4 days in, and I had been working from 8 a.m. to kind of midnight, and then suddenly something unlocked, and its structure of the book seemed completely obvious to me. So I would say holidays are a good thing. Thank you.
Hi. I think we're all affected by art, and we can all, look back on our lives and remember moments where we were cracked open by someone's artistry and by their capacity to kind of speak to our lived experience. And I just wanted to know if there are any moments that come to mind for you where you recall that was when you realized that words held meaning and that they meant something in this world.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much. I have several, and they are all, interestingly enough, performance related. I saw a production of the playwright Annie Baker's play Aliens, and a very young, I think at that time, not very known actor, Dane DeHaan, was in it. And there's a moment in the play where all he does at the end is sing "If I Had a Hammer," which I admit does not sound promising. I was weeping. It was extraordinary. And the fact that a work of art through such a simple device could move me so profoundly made me really think about what you need to create those moments of emotional breakthrough in a work of fiction. That you often think you need a lot of narrative architecture and you need to build a culminating moment. It can be something very, very simple and very pure, and it can affect you very profoundly. Another performance that has stayed with me always is a piece by the choreographer Jerome Bell, which was shot at the Paris Opera House. And it was the final days of A Dancer in the Corps de Ballet. It was the final string of her performances before she retired. So she was in her early 40s, and she was just doing the kind of last 5 performances of her life. And she just sat on stage and she reflected about what it meant to be an artist. And also she spoke very honestly about what it meant to not attain the heights of achievement that she had dreamt of as a young dancer, and it's completely devastating. And Jerome Bell does this beautiful thing where she says, now I would like to show you a performance that moves me profoundly. And then she sits on the stage and she watches somebody else dancing. So this idea that, you know, it seems like stagecraft, but it's something very, very simple that reveals the profundity of both our disappointments and our desires. And to me, that's something that art can do.
Hi, modern feminism can be very loud and active. I was wondering where you see the strength in the passivity of the female characters.
The psychoanalyst Darian Leader, I remember seeing him do an interview, and somebody said, what is the point of psychoanalysis if it doesn't make you better? And he said, the point is that it allows you to see. And I think that's something I think about a lot in relationship to my characters. They do not have, as you say, a great deal of agency, and they are quite quiet in a lot of ways. But I think they do see the limits of the illusion of agency, and they are willing to live without that illusion. And I think that is a difficult strength, but I do think it is a strength.
I'd like to end by saying that what I admire about Katie's work is how you've transformed uncertainty into a source of strength, and you figured out how to write about unknowing, about not knowing, with incredible precision and power. And your women don't need to have all the answers. They just need to be fully present to their own complexity. And I've enjoyed reading all of your words immensely, so thank you.
I absolutely agree with you, Caroline. And Katie has discovered that the most empowering thing you can do as a novelist is create space for women's full emotional range, including the parts that resist that easy categorization. Her work shows us that complexity itself can be a form of agency. So thank you, Katie. And I really, really appreciated reading your novels and having that conversation, all the three of us, and to be with all of you here in the Sette Library. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon podcast. To discover more about it, you will find images, links, and references on the Chanel website. À bientôt!